In the 70s, we had a new moment of international relations as a science, with the idea of complex interdependence, the emergence of the new liberalism and dependency theory. In order for us to have science, it is necessary to have a consensus about the object under analysis and the method of investigation. However, three narratives appear on how to think about the international and how to produce science from it. From this, we have the inter-paradigm debate, based on the philosophy of science on how to deal with this problem. After this debate, we have a situation that led, on the one hand, to the lessening of the strength of Marxism, which will be seen in an upcoming video, and also the debate focused on realism and liberalism, reaching a new consensus called rationalism. Rationalism is concerned with understanding how to distinguish the strategies of the state and the cost-benefit ratio that guides their choices. Therefore, we have the neo-neo debate, and one of the most relevant formulations that emerges is the introduction of an analysis model called game theory. This theory seeks to understand simultaneous decision-making in the context of interaction between different actors. Thus, we have a new way of thinking with a structure that generates a relationship of uncertainty about the cooperation of states that take decisions simultaneously. Finally, the video will talk about the new role that liberals believe institutions can offer within this reality of simultaneity. Until now, the narrative of institutions that we have is the one created by realism, in which its functionality is linked to hegemonic power. Institutions can be important to the international system because they create the structures that allow us to work around some of the uncertainties that anarchy imposes on states, and so we can observe cooperation where it did not exist before. At the beginning of international relations, we had a heavy input from the US, with influence on scientific paradigms on how to produce scientific knowledge, in which, to achieve credibility, it is necessary to have the implementation of these methodologies. In the 60s, this seemed to make sense from a realist point of view. It was a time of hostility and distrust between the different forces. From the 70s onwards, we began to observe important changes that mark a set of transformations that generate other concerns. We observe the oil crisis, which changes the scenario of the international system, in which previously weak countries are now becoming stronger in their impact on international geopolitics. In addition, important economic changes have also taken place. In the 50s, there was an explosion of American growth. They export and grow greatly. In the 60s, the kind of growth that Japan and Europe were experiencing allowed them to produce reliable competitors in the US export process. In the 70s, this competition hurt the balance of trade of Americans. This raises an alarm in the US power structure. The fact that currency was linked to gold becomes harmful to American products since they become more expensive. They choose to undo this parity between the dollar and gold with the aim of lowering the price of the dollar, allowing an increase in the trade balance and rebalancing the structure of the American economy at the expense of the economy of other countries. This shakes the structure of the international order, in which there is great economic concern. In this, realism does not seem to be enough to interpret the scenario. In addition, we have the discussion that new actors become prominent in the 70s. At the end of the gold-dollar standard, American companies that had their entire productive structure installed in the US based on this good activity of the international financial system and from the cheaper logistics began to distribute their production line across the globe. By transnationalizing, they become very important in the countries where they settle. Also in the 70s, we had big agreements on arms control, where both the Americans and the Soviets began to think that their internal economic issue may be something more important to worry about than spending their GDP on creating missiles that won't be used. Therefore, actors should analyze other strategies regarding how to project their power. We also have the fact that international humanitarian organizations are starting to reach the world. We have organizations that used to only work in the Western world and now act all over the world. For example, we have Human Rights Watch, Greenpeace, and more. Now they also become actors in the international system. These are some of the factors that show the transformations in the world in the 70s, and that a realistic lens is not enough to interpret. We can no longer say that it is a process of American hegemony, because actors can make strategies that constrain US behavior and create reports that announce US behavior in a certain place, for example. From this, an alternative perspective is born, the theory of complex interdependence. Keohane and Nee propose that the pattern of activity that realism manages to observe is relevant to the understanding understanding of international reality. But there are other things that realism does not explain. They do not propose to nullify realism, but rather that international politics is within a polarity. On the one hand, we have a set of processes marked by a realistic view of the world, in which we have a process of interdependence called anarchy, where a pattern of behavior based on the logic of distribution of capabilities emerges. On the other hand, we have another opposite narrative that is equally irrelevant to understanding the international system. Thus, we accept the idea that we have other key actors beside the state. Furthermore, actors have different agendas and strategies that reflect the plurality of ways to intervene in reality. It's a more complex relationship where we have linkage politics. Linkage politics is when we characterize actors who work with different goals and different dynamics. It is when we have, for example, humanitarian organizations that pressure the government bureaucracy to promote a certain environmental agenda while negotiating within the domestic legislature the construction of certain agreements. This allows them to build an agenda that influences the position of other states in the international system. Furthermore, we have a myriad of actors who act simultaneously and at different levels. Therefore, the international relationship cannot be measured just as the interaction between states, but as the result of the interaction of this variation of actors of different nature and objectives. For realism, the fact that we have only one type of actor leads to a type of process that causes an interaction to emerge with a single functioning pattern, which creates a context of repeatable patterns of interdependence. On the other hand, by having the interaction of actors with different processes, we have a complex interdependence. This means that unlike anarchy, which is a process of simple interdependence where a single clear, repeatable pattern of behavior emerges, in complex interdependence, we cannot clearly anticipate which pattern will emerge from the interaction between those forces. But there is a problem. In order to have a science about the international, there must be a consensus around the object. Thus, there must be an agreement on what it means, what its structure is, who its actors are, and what are the methods by which it is possible to measure the knowledge produced about the international. Complex interdependence theory introduces the idea that there are actors and processes that realism does not recognize. Thus, the set of phenomena that the theory of interdependence considers as part of the international is not the same as the set of realism, so we don't have the same object. Thus, the idea of a positivist science would not be viable. Although those theories bring different possibilities, there is an inability to synthesize them in a single science project. This is the inter-paradigm debate. It marks the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s. It is the debate between neo-realist theory, the neoliberal theory, and the neo-Marxist theory. In this, three authors of the philosophy of science stand out. We have the Polish Karl Popper, who focuses on the idea of falsification as what allows the defense of the scientific character of a given idea or a given field of action. Why is it important? Because the acquired information is not data, because the researcher may be starting from premises that someone may later find out to be wrong. So it is not about confirming certain information. It's about deconfirming certain information. This is much more important. Science is supported by the ability to produce an experiment in a clear and objective way that another person in another context is able to repeat the hypothesis that the author enunciated and reproduce the conditions of that experiment and find another answer. Once we have a different answer, science has really discovered something. The example Popper uses is the idea of the black swan. Prior to the colonization of Australia, it made no sense to postulate the color of the swan's feather as a variable, because until then, in the available empirical universe, all swans were white. But in Australia, there were black swans, and that was not known. From the observation of the first black swan, this confirmation added knowledge about the reality of the swan. Another important author is Thomas Kuhn, writer of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He criticizes Popper and says that in scientific research, it is possible to see that the scientist is attached to a set of premises, since all his training is associated with that. When reality begins to distrust the premises within which the researcher's thinking is structured, he does not discard his research and create another one. The researcher seeks to circumvent reality in order to bring that event that thus confirms his theory as an anomaly. The black swan is seen as the exception. The swan is still portrayed as a white animal. So we have the idea that scientific practice does not work the way Popper idealized it. This is an important problem for the philosophy of science. The production of knowledge involves the idea of paradigm. Paradigm is a set of assumptions that organize summarize your worldview about a given object. It is so fundamental as it is not possible to produce knowledge outside the paradigm. The paradigm is important because science only accumulates data within the hegemony of a given paradigm. Only when the scientific community has a consensus around the object in which everyone works within the same paradigm that the scientific community can produce knowledge. From there, it is possible to accumulate data and science advances. So, when we don't have any anomaly, that is, when everyone is within the same paradigm, we have normal science. Here we don't have many obstacles to produce this knowledge. The problem is that when we have more than one paradigm, there is no efficient communication between them. We cannot measure a liberal hypothesis against a realist hypothesis because their assumptions about who the actors are and what the structure of the international system is are different. As we'll see in the next video on dependency theory, because it is Marxist, the system is not anarchic. The system is capitalist, and the actor is not the state, but the social class. So, a hypothesis that explains how a class within a capitalist system develops certain strategies can't be compared with Walt's hypothesis about how bipolarity generates instability or not. This is a problem because if there is no measurability, it is not possible to have an accumulation of knowledge. Only during the period of normal science is it possible to accumulate data. Here we have the paradigm hegemony. When we have more than one operating paradigm, we have stagnation in the production of knowledge. This is the inter-paradigm war. Since we have a context of pure competition, there is no communication between different worldviews. The relationship between these different perspectives will only change if someone wins and someone loses. In this, we have a new hegemony with a new paradigm, and it will be possible to accumulate data again. This idea of paradigm will be opposed by Lakatos. He argues that most of the criticisms that Kuhn makes of Popper make sense. The idea of looking at scientific communication is not so transparent. This can compromise the development of scientific practice, but it does not necessarily lead to inter-paradigm warfare conditions. Rather than deciding who produces the proper hypothesis, it is possible to decide to what extent that paradigm is a progressive paradigm and to what extent it is regressive. A progressive paradigm is one that, in view of the transformations that reality presents, manages to offer models that can explain everything that was explained previously, as well as observing the new information that reality presents. Keohane and Nee argue that complex interdependence generates a progressive paradigm. It is an understanding that recognizes the patterns of behavior that mark the hostility and competition that are systematized in Wald's idea of distribution of capabilities in the 60s, while also understands the effects produced by the transnationalization of large American companies, the internationalization of humanitarian organizations, economic transformations generated by the oil crisis, and the breaking of the dollar standard. This whole new set of transformations can also be absorbed into this new conceptual framework that they are creating. In the author's view, this would make this new liberalism bring a progressive research program. He explains what came before, and they manage to explain the transformations that reality imposes, whereas the regressive paradigm is no longer able to deal with the new information that reality offers, and is increasingly concerned with defending its hypothesis. They seek to argue that realism has become a regressive paradigm. This paradigm explains a smaller and smaller part of reality, and becomes less and less efficient in dealing with new events that appear over time. This is important because if we manage to differentiate these paradigms, even when we have two paradigms at the same time, we do not have stagnation in the scientific production process, we have some degree of measurability. Even if we have a communication problem, it doesn't lead to the same kind of stagnation that Kuhn proposes in his work. Throughout the 80s, considering that there is still a divergence and fragmentation which does not produce a single science model in which everyone can rely, they began to build a kind of approximation. Realists are beginning to adapt their analysis model a little in order to incorporate the fundamental elements of liberal thought. Liberals will also begin to modify their thinking a bit to add some ideas that are very important for the starting point of realistic thinking. Liberals make the biggest concessions. They give up a little of the idea of complex interdependence and begin to accept two fundamental premises of realist thought: the idea of anarchy as a priority structure, since the context in which international relations operate is the context marked by anarchy. We have cooperation and different actors, but the main one is the state. The state is not the only actor, but it is more important than the other actors. Thus, they come to have the same view on the system and on the unit, and it is possible to build hypotheses that can be measured against each other. The fundamental concession the realists make is that they leave this structural narrative about having only one pattern of functioning that repeats itself over time. Moreover, the objective of knowledge is not to know this structure, but to explain the behavior of the units. Both realists and liberals will carry out a new joint research program where they have different hypotheses but seek to explain the same. How do the basic units, the states, make choices in a context of anarchy? What stimulates these choices and what tragedies emerge from this interaction in this space marked by anarchy? So these thoughts are not the same, but they are close. The structure and the basic unit are the same. The difference is in understanding how that unit makes choices within that framework. Here, the main difference between realist and liberal approaches is the distinction between absolute and relative gains. Considering that the objective of knowledge becomes to understand how the laws that govern the functioning of the international concretely impact the functioning of certain states, realists propose hypotheses in which states' tragedies are supported by relative gains. This means that the state makes choices about whether or not it will cooperate based on if others will earn more or less. For example, I enter a cooperative structure, such as the European Union, and gain something and have a perspective of sustainable growth. The implication, I observe, is that the forces involved in that agreement earn more than I do, and they tend to benefit more systematically than I do, and can use it to embarrass me and use it against me. If I think that way, I would tend to be resistant to cooperation unless I am the privileged actor. Liberals understand that states make many of their choices in terms of absolute gains. They tend to look at how much they will earn tomorrow compared to what they have today, rather than what they will earn compared to what the other will earn. This understanding of gain guides my decision internationally. How do actors act strategically? From game theory, we have the idea that an action can depend on the action of others. Applied to international relations, there is no point in developing a theory of strategic action based on just one actor. It needs to observe how actors coordinate expectations and make choices based on them. Here we have a reflection on the prisoner's dilemma. The thought experiment goes as such. Two criminals are in separate cells, unable to communicate. The police do not have enough evidence to sentence both without further evidence. The police offered the prisoners a deal. They can accuse each other of the crime with the following conditions. If both prisoners say the other did it, each will serve 2 years in prison. If one says the other did it and the other stays silent, the prisoner will serve 3 years and the accuser 0. If both prisoners stay silent, each will serve 1 year in prison. If both prisoners stay silent, each will serve 1 year in prison. In game theory, altruistic behavior, staying silent, is called cooperating, while accusing the other is called defecting. What should they do? If they were able to communicate and they trusted each other, the rational choice is to stay silent. That way, each serves less time in prison than they would otherwise. But how could each know the other won't accuse them? After all, people tend to act out of self-interest. The cost of being the one to stay silent is too high. The expected outcome when the game is played is that both accuse the other and serve 2 years. So why is this dilemma important? It allows us to realize that what conditions behavior is the expectation of the behavior of others. Game theory helps us to understand the problem of anarchy in a different way. Anarchy is no longer a reflection on the state of nature and on the possibility of violence. Anarchy becomes a configuration that produces uncertainty about the behavior of the other. It increases the degree of uncertainty about the possibility of cooperation between actors. For the liberal, we have a fundamental contribution to how we think about the problem of international institutions. How does the realist see the problem of institutions? It's not that institutions don't exist. They exist and are important. They have autonomy and are part of a power project. NATO, for example, only makes sense within the bipolar logic of the Cold War and within the need to stop the Soviet advance. Without this configuration, creating NATO would not make sense from the point of view of the effort made in cooperation cooperation between countries. For example, we have a cause that makes sense within the power project to which they are submitted, but outside of the dynamic of this project, this type of cooperation would not be so successful. For the liberal, what is the use of this institution? It serves to produce mechanisms and processes that allow these same actors to circumvent this uncertainty structurally produced by anarchy. If the structure is useful, if it facilitates communication between actors, create efficient cooperation channels, and creates norms that help certain spaces to cooperate and form integrated policies, this institution persists even if the configuration of power that made it possible changes at some point. If we don't have that, if the institution only works because it is supported by the power of the hegemonic force and its interests, from the moment the hegemonic force shifts, this institution tends to fail. This is important because it proposes an alternative to how you think about the way the institution works, as well as a very big shift from letting go of the kind of narrative produced by normative political liberalism in the early 20th century. That's all. Thanks for watching.